Yes. So thank you again for the introduction, and I feel honored to be part of this event. Please note that the views that I will be sharing are my own and do not necessarily represent positions of my employer. Some of you may wonder why I, as an employee of a US headquartered company, have been invited to talk about how the EU Standardisation Strategy affects European industry. In fact, Europe is not only an important market for Intel, but has always been an important business location for the company. Intel researches, develops, and produces to a significant extent in Europe, and has recently announced its intent to massively expand all of its activities through an investment package of up to 80 billion euros. When we look at the EU standardization framework and strategy, we do so as a company that feels us at home in Europe. And we like to think that in that respect, we are no different than multinational companies headquartered in the EU. Intel participates in more than 250 standards development organizations and in about 700 working groups where the standards are actually developed. In addition to working group participation, Intel employees are active in the administration of many of these bodies, sitting on boards of directors, chairing various committees, and forming new standard bodies for the next generation of technology. Directly and indirectly, hundreds, if not thousands, of Intel employees around the globe are involved in developing standards and implementing them into our products. We welcome the EU Commission strategy on standardization, and I welcome the emphasis that the strategy puts on standardization as a catalyst and enabler for the EU to create a resilient, green, and digital EU single market. This is a very inspiring message for the standardization community at large and for industry in particular. Standards are important means for industry to contribute to shaping that market, and the EU's vision holds lots of opportunities for companies operating in the EU, regardless of whether they are headquartered in the EU or not. From an industry perspective, successful standardization requires an emphasis on voluntary, global, industry-led standards and standardization processes that ensure open participation and adhere to WTO TBT principles. The voluntary development of standards and the voluntary adoption of standards enables innovation and underpins the public-private partnership in using standards to support public policy and compliance with regulations. Global standards create the economies of scale that are critical to industry's ability to deliver the promises of technology advancements to consumers and citizens at affordable prices. Industry-led standards development fosters broad market adoption and ensures that timing and technology choices reflect implementation realities. Empirically, industry-led standardization has always yielded better results than government-led standardization. At the same time, open participation ensures that those who are affected by standards are part of shaping the outcome, including societal stakeholders and policymakers. Many initiatives and actions under the EU Standards Strategy support and seek to strengthen those principles. Some others are less explicit in that respect, and there is a risk that their implementation could create tension between global versus EU standards and between industry-driven versus government-led standards. Let me pick out a few actions under the strategy to illustrate this. The action to work on concrete solutions and targets to accelerate the availability of harmonized standards in support of new regulation may not seem like the most striking action under this strategy, but it addresses what is perhaps the most important problem to fix. I believe that if we do not manage to fix that problem, the ambitions behind a great number of the other actions under the strategy are doomed to fail. The NLF and harmonized standards are the most important and the well-proven cornerstone of the ESS. Member state and industry inputs into the development of the standard strategy have unilaterally urged the Commission to address the practical issues that have been plaguing harmonized standards of recent. There's no effective alternative to solving the issues caused by that. Particularly, I believe that it would be a fallacy to believe that greater use of common specifications could ever be an effective fallback solution. Firstly, common specifications will always carry the risk of introducing technical barriers to trade, ultimately resulting in less choice and higher prices for European consumers. Secondly, the time that may be saved by simply setting a common specification instead of allowing stakeholder consensus to emerge will not normally translate into an overall time saving. Rather, the lack of involvement of a breadth of stakeholders, including industry, risks severe implementation and market adoption issues, and worst case, lead to outdated technical requirements that result in potential product vulnerabilities. Industry has therefore observed the increased provisioning for the possibility of deploying common specifications instead of relying on harmonized standards with great concern. Notably, the standards strategy also includes an action to develop clear criteria and processes for when and under which condition this option should be used. I believe that those criteria should diligently constrain rather than expand the practice. The latest developments that can be observed some standards and product safety-related legislation, such as the Cyber Resilience Act, are worth looking at in this perspective. They could define interesting guardrails to ensure that common specifications remain what they were intended to be, the exception, not the rule. The standardization strategy also rightfully notes that European competitiveness, technological sovereignty, the ability to reduce dependencies, and the protection of EU values will critically depend on how successful European actors are in standardization at the international level. The EU is doubtlessly a leader and frontrunner in creating regulatory frameworks to address the transformative opportunities and risks posed by new technologies, such, for example, through the Artificial Intelligence Act and the Cyber Resilience Act. Shaping international standards to ensure that they can be used in support of these regulations is key to translating that lead into a competitive advantage for EU industry. Conversely, harmonized standards that deviate from international standards inevitably introduce a competitive disadvantage for European industry and ultimately lead to higher prices for European consumers. In fact, European actors are well represented and well respected in many areas of international standardization and often perform leadership functions. In addition to actions directed at boosting the capabilities and fostering the involvement of EU actors, the strategy also includes actions to structurally coordinate the European approach to international standardization among EU member states and to coordinate positions in international standardization with like-minded partners. Inevitably, such structural coordination needs to strike a balance between, on the one hand, establishing an EU identity of interests in international standardization, and on the other hand, preventing systemic bloc voting that would challenge individual voting rights for EU member states. So far, the implementation of the strategy has coped well with our challenges. Above the level of individual actions described in the strategy, the perceived narrative around the strategy has been having quite a significant impact on European industry. Some have perceived that narrative to convey the message that the EU ultimately intends to assert more top-down control on standardization and to limit the participation of global stakeholders. The implementation of actions under the strategy has so far not justified that perception. The amendment to Regulation 1024/2012 to prescribe that national EU and EEA member states have sole decision authority when it comes to developing and approving harmonized standards was arguably fine-tuning already established ISO governance mechanisms. The voting reform that ETSI decided upon in response to the EC's call for ESOs to modernize their governance was arguably overdue. It cured very real imbalances in voting power, but did not exclude anybody from participating and having a say. Participation in the high-level forum on standardization is limited to organizations that are not controlled by foreign entities, which is legitimate given its political nature. But at the same time, the ICT multi-stakeholder platform on standardization has been continued, and it continues to include the breadth of global stakeholders required to reflect the global nature of ICT standardization in particular. In parallel, however, ETSI has been excluded from some recent standardization requests. Equally in parallel, individuals employed by non-EU headquartered companies have been excluded from representing member organizations of expert groups established by the Commission. Some trade associations have unfortunately responded to that trend by discouraging employees of non-EU headquartered companies from taking internal leadership positions or from externally representing the association. In that way, the strategy has nevertheless caused a split among European industry by discriminating between non-EU headquartered companies and their EU headquartered peers. That is unfortunate, and I believe unwarranted and unhelpful to the goals of the strategy. And while I called execution of the strategy so far a job well done, an important piece is still missing: the announced review of Regulation 1024/2012. I believe that the legal framework and the European standardization system defined through the regulation stands on very strong and solid ground. The EU will continue to rely on it as a unique competitive strength. It will continue its commitment to global, voluntary, and industry-led standards. Judging from the responses given through the initial opportunity to provide public input to the review, European industry seems to be united in that view. Thank you for your attention.